make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Preserving God-given freedom is of paramount importance, but only for white Christian men who are atop the hierarchy. And for all others, it's authoritarian and at times violent forms of control and governance. They're needed to maintain proper God-given order in families, communities, the nation, and the world. The way to think about it, I think, Will, is like there is no federal right to education. You guys know this, I would imagine, from your work here, but it gets played out in state constitutions. So you get these interesting flavors of policy.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, we are so glad to have you. And if you're watching us on a Roku TV, send us a note because I'm curious on how many people are actually watching us on a Roku TV.
Interesting.
I'm your political host, Will Wright, joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing fine. Thanks, Will.
Hey, and today we have a special treat for you. We are talking with Dr. Kevin Burke. He's from the University of Georgia and one of the authors of a new policy brief from the National Education Policy Center titled Christian Nationalism and Educational Policy in the United States. Dr. Burke is an educational scholar. He does research on the intersection of culture, faith, and public schooling, and how belief systems and political movements shape what happens in classrooms and legislatures. And today we are going to be talking to him about that NEPC document, Christian Nationalism, Educational Policy in the United States. So we are just so glad to have you on the show. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thank you so much for having me, gentlemen. I really appreciate it.
Well, I guess just to start off first, like what is the NEPC? Like, put that into context for anybody that's never heard of the organization and what they do. Like, let's start there. What is the NEPC?
Yeah, so it's housed at the University of Colorado. It's important to say that I'm not an employee or direct employee of the National Education Policy Center, but the focus of the center is to provide educational policy analysis at the intersection of sound evidence in the direction of deliberative democracy and rooted in, and these are the ideas that I really like, and this is from their site, of justice, inclusion, and kindness. At the level of education and religion, which can often feel relatively difficult. There's a guy named Bob Kunzman who's at the University of Indiana who talks about the need in public education for ethical dialogue. And the idea would be that with your interlocutors, and I think this is what you all engage in really nicely in this space, like you do not have to convert to whatever the position is of your interlocutor, but you do have to engage with them in such a way that you understand that their beliefs are sincerely held. And so it strikes me that is the project of the NEPC, is to provide sound analysis and the belief that if we might disagree at the level of policy, we probably are engaging with people who believe deeply in whatever they're writing about or arguing.
So this new policy that is out, the Christian Nationalism and Educational Policy, walk me through kind of the evolution of this document. Because, I mean, most people, when they think of educational policy, probably don't associate it with Christian nationalism, but your document specifically kind of ties the two together. So, like, how did this document come into existence?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. So, I had the good fortune of writing an article in an educational journal called Educational Researcher in, I want to say, 2023 with Esther Prins, who's at Penn State, and Mary Juswick, who's at Michigan State. And Esther and Mary grew up in the evangelical movement. And we wrote a piece making an argument that educational research needed to attend more closely to white Christian nationalism and its influence on educational policy, both contemporaneously and historically. This is in the moment after January 6th, and also the confusion for a lot of people as to why there was such white evangelical support for Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and then subsequently, of course, in this most recent election. And there were explainers in a lot of different fields, but not in education. And one of the problems there is educational research has a paucity of research on religion for lots of reasons that maybe we'll talk about here, but maybe we won't. And the second point is that there's been a pretty significant shift in Supreme Court jurisprudence in relation to the establishment of religion, particularly Christianity, in public education. And there's a long history there, but at the juncture of what we're observing, it seems like the driving force of that shift at the Supreme Court is rooted in a sense of Christian nationalism, and often white Christian nationalism.
So just to make sure that like stating the claim that you're making. So like sometimes when we have people on, like, again, if like I've had people on to talk about like books, I won't show the book, but like it's like poetry and prayers and stuff like that. So my questions are different. You know, when it comes to them, I'm not gonna be like, well, can you give me your claim and evidence and premises for that prayer? You know, but like thinking about this is a pretty particular claim, and I just want to make sure it's clear. And I just want to, do you mind if I just kind of try to summarize it? So basically, you're saying there's a coordinated, policy-driven Christian nationalist project shaping the United States education system all the way from K through 12.
Yes, sir. And into college as of the last couple of years.
Into college.
Well. Yeah.
So how do we know that? Essentially, help our audience who take on, like, I'm trying to take on the skeptic, you know. How do you actually know that's not true? Isn't it just like a restoration of something that's like been lost, that the liberals and the Marxist kind of like influence came in and clearly took over? And how about all these people? Like, haven't you seen this free speech report where it's like, I don't know if you have seen that, the 2026 college free speech report. Yeah. So, you know, like how and even the highest grade is like a B-.
Yeah.
There's not even an A in terms of like
Sure.
freedom of speech on college. So I'm just kind of trying to set the like tone for people that might be skeptics.
Yeah.
How do we know that
and
this
I
is
think
happening?
it's also fair to say, like, there's methodological issues with that fire survey that we don't have to get into, and there are certain colleges that they leave out, for instance. But that, you know, that's okay. Like, that's not the engagement here. I think there's a long history of Christianity's overlap with the American public educational system. And that's a winding road to the point where we might make a claim that Christian nationalism has undergirded the American public educational system for its entire establishment. What is new, I think, is the most recent manifestation, which you're characterizing, I think, as backlash, but Chelsea Eben, who has written about this pretty convincingly, would suggest that this is actually a prefigured policy. So we should give our colleagues on the right, and I know that you're on the right to some respect, we should give them...
To some respect, yes.
Yeah, we should give them credit for the agency that they've taken, which is the sense that, like, it's really useful to suggest that there's a backlash to cultural Marxism or whatever in the schools, which then obscures the fact that this was actually a coordinated political project over time, which said essentially, like, the central socializing institution of American social life is American public education. And so the reason why we have debates over what should be included in curriculum is because that is essentially the only shared, for the most of the population, not all the population, but the only shared experience that we have across the population that then determines how we think about history, how we think about language, often how we think about identity. And certainly students come into those spaces with religious identities, and that colors how they experience that space. But for the last 50 or 60 years or so, up into this current Supreme Court, the understanding has been that the public educational system should avoid the establishment of a particular religion through religious practices by representatives of the public educational system. And that has changed in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years, from a deference to the Establishment Clause, which says we should not establish a religion, and a shift towards the Freedom of Religion Clause, but with a very particular take on whose religion should be free in that space. And our argument is it's a very particular kind of Christian nationalist religion that should be free in that space.
Yeah, you know, after Kennedy v. Bremerton, the Supreme Court, I think, essentially did away with the limit test, which is sort of like this test to determine if something violates the Establishment Clause. How do you think what's the word I'm looking for? Like when something goes away, I'm having a brain flatulence. But anyways, when the limit test went away, what role do you think?
Superseded, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know. I need to get at
because there's a new doctrine that's taken it over, essentially.
Yeah. But the limit test had like a 3-part sort of like test, and it said, hey, if it meets these things, that either meets or doesn't meet the Establishment Clause. So like, what effect do you think that had kind of in the larger picture of Christian nationalism making its way into schools?
I think it was the case that it was largely settled that because of stare decisis and because of case law, like we weren't going to do Christian prayer by teachers in schools, or we weren't going to post the 10 Commandments in schools because of prior decisions. And of course, states have always pushed a little bit on that, but you see a cascading line of states, Louisiana, prime among them, but not only Louisiana and not only in the South, essentially seeking to establish Christian religion in public educational spaces. Now, one version of that would be to say, well, the 10 Commandments are just posted there. You don't have to engage with them. But of course, we understand how that works in that space. The other version is like you have, for instance, the Bluebonnet curriculum in Texas, which is explicitly teaching biblical values. And you might imagine, this is probably not, excuse me, this is a very particular interpretation of what biblical values might be in that space. I mean, it's a very specific kind of evangelical Christian establishment in that space. But I should probably lay out, like, as you asked, Josh, like, how do we define Christian nationalism? How are we thinking about it in terms of education? I'll just lay out the 4 tenets for the audience, and that might be helpful as a baseline. So just generally speaking, I work in curriculum theorizing, and the main question there is like, what knowledge is of most worth and what most ought we teach? And like, that's always in tension. It always has been. Like, this is the great debate of what we should teach in schools and what schools should do. And that's an understanding of a lot of people who think about education, but particularly I think Christian nationalists in this space say like public education should actively promote Christianity or Christian values. Wokeness in the classroom introduced by teachers or through curriculum is a danger to those Christian values. This is, I think, why you see a lot of the pieces coming out now about like how empathy is against Christian belief or whatever. Christians are victims of a secularizing society. You alluded to this a little bit, Josh, earlier, like subject to godless brainwashing in public schools. And in order to make schools prioritize Christian values, the end sanctifies the means. So essentially any action is permissible, indeed demanded. Like you have to do it because if you really believe this is true, then like the schools themselves are actively undermining Christian values in a Christian nation.
I really appreciate how you are articulating this. I find myself like really almost like in a sense mesmerized because I hear what you're saying and I'm trying to hear every word of it and understand like there is the question that we have to wrestle with right now is what gets to be part of and influence the education of a massive amount of people, right? It's universalized, it's generalized, right? So once it's enshrined or codified in a law or declared unconstitutional or constitutional, that changed, I mean, those ramifications, right? That ripple effect is intentionally created within the system to be vast. And so everyone is going to somehow be affected by this one way or the other because they're going to have to choose homeschool, public school. It's almost going to be a reversal of the homeschool movement is now going to be people exiting the public school system if they can to try to teach their own values, right? If it becomes this kind of like vision of the Christian nationalism that you are resisting. And, I think one thing that I would love to like get your thoughts on is this idea that every state catechizes in some way. Like every state is going, and I mean, I know that's an intentional word. Yeah, and I know that's a religious word, but they do. It seems like every state is going to come to a place where, hey, what do we do with these little people that we need to figure out some way to help them? I mean, my wife, anyway, I'm not going to I'm going to put her on blast, but I've known many teachers that have said like, dude, this is you can tell it is institutionalized to the T. When you walk into a public school system, and it is designed like you can just see the ramifications of all these things that she's going to now face as a result of this. And I just feel like, how do we because I'm trying to get to the place where, I agree with you that we shouldn't have this particular version of Christian nationalism. What I know that you're saying, I've heard enough about it that intuitively, I don't want that being taught as something that's required by any means. And I am concerned about what seems like an infringement and a continued redefinition of these, of Establishment Clause doctrine now to like history and heritage kind of like language, which is a bit concerning. Like anytime we start tying ethnic heritage, like things like that, it gets concerning because it's not necessarily an ideal or principle we're appealing to at that point, but something different. And so I guess what is the, if we're digging deep, what's the issue with catechizing? Isn't everyone going to try to do that? So how do we decide who gets to do it? And why is Christian nationalism in particular egregious in this?
That's to the extent that I love my job, that has been my job for the course of the last 15 or 20 years.
Thank you for what you do, by the way. I've never met someone that develops curriculum and been able to thank them. Thank you.
But the question really is, what values do we put forth in the public education system, in any kind of education system? So the relatively settled doctrine had been, although certainly since the Supreme Court decisions in the 60s that got rid of public prayer and then Ten Commandments stuff, there has been a sense, and you see it in language that, for instance, like Mike Huckabee used after, I think it was 9/11. He said, this is what happens when, it was Sandy Hook. He said, this is what happens when you push God out of school, public school. And my response would be how weak is your God? God's still there. I mean, everybody walks in with whatever religious instantiation that they have. It's in the discourse that they speak. It's in the way that they read. It's how they interact. But the ascension was essentially, and this is in the official standards from the main social studies body in the U.S., which is absolutely, we should teach about religion. The understanding, though, is you teach a cosmopolitan version of religion, which is essentially comparative religion. People will be more tolerant, the assumption is, if they know about everybody's religious backgrounds. It will make us better readers. It will make us better citizens. That's unsatisfying to people who see their job, indeed their faith, as imbued with the idea that you have to evangelize. So one of the stories I always tell, my colleague who wrote this with me, who's not here, did a study of 3 teachers who came through our program who were religious in certain instantiations, one of whom taught in public education and was a great teacher, but did not evangelize in her public school classroom and felt like she was going to go to hell as a result of that. And dealt with that all the time and still didn't do it, which is really, the sense was she didn't know what the line was in terms of what was allowed in that space, but she also understood, I think, public education as a pluralistic project where you don't do that sort of evangelizing. I think that's probably what goes away, Will, with the sort of Kennedy v. Bremerton stuff and whatever else comes down the line. But the big distinction, I think, Josh, is there had been a sense that public schools were a place where you taught about religion as opposed to teaching your religion as the way forward. There were always instances where that was not true, but the broader consensus was that's what we did. And I think that is what Christian nationalism explicitly pushes against. You do not need to know about other religions except in the context of their being dead or probably fallen. And the religion that you need to know because we're trying to save you is this particular instantiation of Christianity.
I'm curious, the policy seems to frame recent fights over books, prayer, school choice, not necessarily as small community sort of incidents, but more systemic, more national, or at least that's the impression that I got. And I'm curious on at what point in time did you and your team sort of look at kind of the educational landscape and then saw Christian nationalism? Or was it kind of just the accumulation of all these different things, like the books, the prayer, the school choice? It was all these dots help create the picture as you're connecting them.
Yeah, I really think, as I said earlier, the big question was, for a lot of people who are in the educational research community who don't think a lot about religion, which, as I say, is a lot of my colleagues. They're great, God love them, but it's just not their interest, and or they don't see it as particularly important in the classroom. I would say that it's very important. But in any event, this was an entire field that was stunned by what happened with the election in 2016. And so you look for explanatory variables. And then you do a little bit of digging into, for instance, like how do you end up with somebody like Betsy DeVos, who's in charge of the Department of Education in that first instantiation of the Trump administration? If you don't track anything in the state of Michigan, or you're not all that interested in school choice, or you're only interested in school choice from a policy standpoint, and you don't pay attention to the kind of religious undergirding that has come from being Dutch Reformed from Western Michigan, and how that drives a particular kind of ideology. Like you miss all of these things. So fortunately, because of Mary and Esther's work and my own particular kind of strange upbringing in the Catholic Church and as an all-boys Catholic school alum and then writing my dissertation there, I have a real interest in the ways in which religion inflects on public education. So that's been there forever. But I'll give you one other story and then try to finish answering the question. My advisor, who's at Michigan State, was Jewish from Israel. And so he always talked about how he had the ability to ask lots of questions about American public education, about things that were strange to him that were normalized to us. And that actually opened a lot of doors for me in relation to like, what is it that Judith Butler talks about learning to see the edges of the frames that blind us? Like, what are the edges of the frames of things that I can't see in relation to this religious project? So that brings us then to this, like, what are the explanatory variables that might actually tie together the school choice movement, all the book banning stuff, and then this push to bring religion and prayer, specifically Christianity and prayer, into schools again? And people might argue it's not white Christian nationalism, it's lots of other things. We think that white Christian nationalism is a pretty useful heuristic for understanding why this is all happening.
You know, because when you say stuff like school choice, you know, and even when folks talk about like homeschooling, for instance, I always get a little like a little cringy because I think I agree with most of the research about at least sort of like the Christian nationalists leveraging school choice as a sort of like tool to, you know, I don't want to say indoctrinate, but basically like have a religious focus curriculum at home. And I think that's fine. If people want to do that, knock yourself out. Like, cause we homeschool too. Like when my oldest son had a lot of medical problems, we homeschooled for the longest time. I was like really upset because like I was paying taxes still, you know, but like it was a period. I wish we could do it more because I think there is a lot of benefit to it, but I'm curious for you just kind of draw the distinction like between, you know, homeschooling, school choice, vouchers, because some of these programs are actually good, in my opinion, I think, right?
Yeah, I think so. Cheryl Field Smith, who's a colleague of mine, has written pretty extensively about Black homeschooling. So she might be somebody that would be interesting for you to think with. Well, like that there are lots of different decisions that parents are making in relation to what their kids ought best do in relation to schooling. I think the particular instantiation that I'm thinking about in relation to school choice has to do with two things, one of which is the central ideology of starving the beast, which is the move to get public funding out of public schools through the school choice movement in order to support particular kinds of religious schools or homeschool movement. Now, not every parent who's doing that work is thinking in that way, but that is an underlying ideology that runs through, you know, the kind of thing that Betsy DeVos is pushing for, which is basically like public education is corrupt in large part because it's a collective project and education itself is an individual good. So this marketizing of education as an individual good is one of the ways in which you smuggle in that idea of, well, parents should have an individual choice, and that individual choice could include public education, but what it really should include is sort of the public paying for wherever I want to send my child. We might have concerns about where that public money goes in relation to what it supports ideologically or religiously. It is the case that Supreme Court jurisprudence right now seems like it will essentially say there was the case in Oklahoma about the Catholic charter school that was essentially struck down because Amy Coney Barrett like recused herself. But the idea is like, it's probably going to end up being the case that public money will end up in religious schools or religious contexts without any kind of repercussions or recourse to standards, or what would you say? Like that money will be gone. And the public will not have a whole heck of a lot of accountability for what will have been taught in that space. This is rooted in thinking about homeschooling and vouchers, the idea that the parents are the first educator of the child. And it's a response to a kind of assumed expertise, like a rejection of expertise of educational actors. And that has long been embedded in American education. And it's originally was rooted in the progressive movement in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s that said, like, we can't trust these poor immigrant parents to educate their kids well to be good Americans. So we got to get them into the public educational system. So like resistance to that kind of paternalism has always been a part of that homeschool and school choice movement as well. So it's a confluence of a lot of things, but I think we ought to be really concerned with the idea that there is a significant movement that wants public money without any kind of accountability, and also really does not believe in public education as a project in the United States.
Man, so I really appreciate it. I keep thinking about this, like, and wanting to think through and kind of I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, again, the purpose of public school, right? So when we originally did it, like, why, maybe even digging a little deeper, why do we even want an educated populace?
Yeah.
To begin with?
Yeah.
What was the purpose of it? How did it kind of like how did this move through time? Because you've alluded to like maybe a sense of like it was Christian nationalists before, right? And there was a time, of course, where 10 Commandments were in the classroom. That's why there were Supreme Court and prayer was done, right? Yeah. And that's why Supreme Court decisions changed that. So what is kind of the history of this to give us some context to understand, like, why did it change as much as you can, but why did it change? What was the kind of logic of those changes? Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wrote a piece that got me in trouble with some people because I always say blame it on the Catholics, which I feel like I can own because we were there. But I mean, you know, the initial law, and that's in the brief, is like the old deluder Satan law, which is one of the best names of a law that you'll ever run into, which is in Massachusetts in the 18th century, which essentially said, like, listen, if you've got a big enough community, we have to come together as a community to pay for that so that our kids will not essentially be deceived by the devil. So this first collective educational movement in the U.S., the first public law was like, we need to have a religious education for people, but we're going to all pay for it. So it was a public project of religious education. So
specifically religious public, like that's what it was. Like, it was explicitly religious.
Now, the problem is what happens is you have immigration, significant immigration in the middle 19th century from Europe, Eastern Europe very specifically, where you have these populations who do not understand themselves in the way that Horace Mann, who's creating the common school movement throughout the colonies in the U.S., right? So we're post-colony there, but through the early states. And essentially the idea was like, we need to have an educated populace because it will improve any number of outcomes, particularly tied to morals and ethics. But the understanding of these schools was like, they're going to be just generally kind of Protestant-y. And so Horace Mann got in trouble with a lot of denominationalists who were like, he's not Christian enough. Like, we need to very particularly be Methodist or whatever in that space. So like you run into the problem of denominationalism pretty quickly in that space. And then you get this influx of Jewish immigrants and Catholic immigrants and German Lutheran immigrants who run into that space. And first of all, they're not considered white yet. Like, you can look at depictions of, you know, Irish in particular and Italians at that time in any kind of political cartoon, and they look like the ways in which African Americans are depicted.
What is it? Irish need not apply. They were like all these like signs in New York and things like that.
There's a great one of like these alligators that are coming on shore and they're wearing like the papal hat, the crozier, like they're going to come take over. So, but the idea was, okay, so what we can do with the public educational system is we can socialize these new immigrants into Americans. And the understanding of what an American was from that standpoint was like, well, they're going to be Protestant and they're going to be white and they're going to be like pretty waspy. And the Catholics, Dagger John Hughes in New York, and then the Bible riots in Baltimore were like, listen, we don't read the same Bible as you. We don't believe in the same kind of Christian faith as you do. And so they're like, we're just going to have our own system if you're going to make us read your Bible. So this is where the conflict comes in, essentially. Like once you get pluralism in the space, it's no longer about, well, we got to have Christianity. It's like, what kind of Christianity are we going to have there? Then the system starts to get changed into a kind of socialization of this American exceptionalism. So you get a shift from American religion in those schools where you're moving away from like McGuffey readers and the New England Primer. And now we're going to start teaching about American secularism and exceptionalism. So it's American civil religion. And that's where you start the progressive
American transcendence. Sorry, would that be American transcendence?
Yeah. And so like you have all these laws that essentially are like, listen, you Catholics and you Lutherans can't have your own schools. These are the Blaine Amendments. Because we're really worried that what you'll end up doing is you'll have loyalty to the Pope and you'll use your own language and you won't become proper Americans. And this is where the original like religious freedom laws run into real problems. And that's what you see in the States still. They still have these Blaine Amendments, which is essentially like you can't fund religious education. You can only fund public education with public funds. And that's all the stuff that's getting overturned by the Supreme Court right now. We might be kind of okay with that because the laws were originally rooted in a kind of racism and anti-Catholicism, anti-Lutheranism. But we might also be concerned with the way in which that money gets used now in the way that people were concerned about it then, I think is fair to say in some ways. So what happens is you get this replacement of denominational Christianity with some sort of American patriotism. And then you get the Supreme Court decisions in the mid-1950s or so. And that's when there's a real movement on the political and religious right to say, well, the schools aren't doing what we want them to do. And either they need to start doing what we want them to do, which is what we thought they were doing in the past, or we're going to try to get the money out of them to support our schools, or we're just going to pull out of the American educational project altogether. So this, the white Christian nationalism stuff is not brand new. The ways in which it's become manifest, I think, in the most recent, like 15 or 20 years, particularly under the Trump administration, is what's troubling.
You map Christian nationalism like as a movement onto like federal policy, state legislatures, local activism, what have you. And a lot of what you wrote in your policy statement sounds a lot like what Project Blitz tried to do. I can't remember 2017 or 2018, which is basically this. It was a congressional prayer caucus. I can't remember the exact group, but to essentially use states as like little like testing centers to roll out a lot of these initiatives. And I'm curious, I'm like, how did you guys trace the movement of Christian nationalism across the educational sectors that you looked at?
Yeah, the laboratories of democracy. Yes. I think, the thing that we haven't laid out that's probably worth laying out before I answer that is that and I'm sure that you've had colleagues on here who, because we cited them all, and thank God for them, because it made our job a lot easier, just the central tenets of white Christian nationalism very particularly, and then we can think about that. It's like there's a rigid and clearly defined social hierarchy that should be maintained under the dominion of Christian God, males over females, adults over children, whites over other ethnic social groups. Preserving God-given freedom is of paramount importance, but only for white Christian men who are atop the hierarchy. And for all others, it's authoritarian and at times violent forms of control and governance. They're needed to maintain proper God-given order in families, communities, the nation, of the world. The way to think about it, I think, Will, is like there is no federal right to education. You guys know this, I would imagine, from your work here, but it gets played out in state constitutions. So you get these interesting flavors of policy, as you said, Josh, like all sorts of different curriculum in different spaces, although Texas used to drive it all because of the way that the textbook publishing worked. Like essentially whatever they established, a lot of states were going to do. But what's important, I think, is you see you see these test flares that were flying up from the states. What we didn't have in the past until Betsy DeVos was in charge was essentially the federal government saying, like, yeah, we should have national school choice. We should have national vouchers. We should really start to support religious education with public funding in ways that the states were doing it before. And then there became like a kind of confluence at the level of the federal policy making as well.
So this seems like a shrinking or a narrowing of the Establishment Clause and an expanding of the Free Exercise Clause. Yet in a particular, for some people, but I guess the question I have is, and I appreciate that, and I understand that's very concerning, and I agree that that is indeed concerning. Does this not, though, expand these kinds of rights for, say, Muslims or Mormons or Catholics in legally, right? I mean, does it set a precedent like that? Is it like, and I guess what I'm saying is like, is it, if this begins to happen, is the advice, well, everyone then should be pushing for their curriculum to be included, you know, whatever it may be, because then it's going to like kind of force the issue. Like, I guess, like, what is this going to create? What is it creating? What is it going to create in terms of that kind of legal doctrine that's going to affect the schools ultimately?
I think it's a great question, Josh. It's one of the ways in which, you know, one of the things that NEPC wanted us to do was like put in recommendations, policy recommendations. Like, we don't have many because this manifestation of Christian nationalism is so recent that we're not entirely sure what pushback, to the degree that there should be pushback, might work, because no one's really done it at the level of policy yet. So, I mean, one example which we wrote in there, which you guys know, is that there was a collection of Jewish mothers in the state of Tennessee who tried to push back under this particular kind of expanded religious freedom grounds against new abortion laws in that state. And they were said to not have standing, but it was an engagement of, well, let's see if this kind of expanded understanding of the free exercise clause applies more broadly than for Christians. We might be worried about, you know, I can't remember the name of the case law, but there was the law that Justice Scalia wrote the opinion for, where it was Native Americans who were using peyote as a part of one of their religious ceremonies. And they were not allowed to do that. This was prior to the current administration's, the current court's jurisprudence. So maybe that would come out differently. But I think the larger concern, Josh, that we might have too is, I had a student who did a dissertation in public schools in the state of Georgia. This is prior to Kennedy v. Bremerton, very particularly, about all the ways in which non-Christian teachers experienced Christian practice in Georgia public schools. A lot of that stuff is fairly innocuous, but it might not be if you are an irreligious person in a public school space who assumed that, well, because this is a public school, there won't be an establishment of religion. Like, we won't have our faculty meeting at the Baptist church with an invocation from the minister. Like, that won't happen. But then it does. And you're like, well, wait a minute, you know, nothing against Baptists. Catholics might do it too, but this was just one of the examples. So the idea was like, what you would have to have then is you would have to have somebody in a small community in Georgia who would have to stand up and say, listen, that's actually violating my rights. And that's a pretty risky thing to do if you are minoritized in any kind of way in relation to your religion, but if you have any other kind of marker that's different from the community, because you might alienate yourself from the community. And certainly maybe the community doesn't intend to do harm to you. But the larger point, Jess, is like, when you have a movement that is really concerned with domination and seems to have pretty strong political power at the moment, we might be really concerned about the ways in which those people who are affected, who might want to take advantage of that religious freedom stuff, might actually be silenced in communities because of the implications of their standing up for whatever religious rights might be expanded to them.
Got it. Gosh, so many questions. I guess I probably should ask one of the more fundamental questions. I know you already kind of talked and defined what Christian nationalism is earlier, but how do you judge? like, is there a scale? Like, is there a mood ring or something? Like, how do you know that somebody is a Christian nationalist, or they are teaching Christian nationalist-centered curriculum?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we wrote in that earlier article is like, I have a very vivid memory of being at Arlington National and my mom being handed my dad's flag in front of his grave with a cross on it, you know? So this is like, Christian nationalism comes in all sorts of different forms. Decide whether that's problematic or not problematic, but it's important to me, right? So the scale from Whitehead and Perry. I think there's the idea of rejectors and resistors and accommodators and ambassadors. The ambassadors and the rejectors are on either side. So rejectors would suggest that, like, listen, we shouldn't have any instantiation of Christianity or any religion in the public sphere that's imposed on other people. And ambassadors would say, yeah, like, this absolutely needs to happen. But resistors and accommodators are kind of in the middle. Like, maybe we're a little bit uncomfortable with it in certain cases, and maybe it's okay in others. How you recognize it, I think for our purposes, like, it's about Christian supremacy. So I don't want to use the pornography definition, like, it if you see it. But if you're in a situation where the idea is like, we need to do this because Christianity is more important than that. Like, we need to teach Christian fundamentals. Ryan Walters in Oklahoma is a great example of this. That gentleman, he's gonna buy all these Bibles for the schools in Oklahoma that are a very particular kind of Bible that is missing very specific parts that are important, and also will pay money to people who are politically connected. Like, this is an instantiation of Christian supremacy in that space. And there are lots of different examples of that. Jeffrey Landry in Louisiana said, we're going to put the 10 Commandments in there. And then he said, I look forward to being sued. And the idea, it's a mark of pride in the sense that, like, I'm going to push this as far as I can go. Maybe because I believe it, maybe because it's, like, politically expedient. But this idea of establishing a kind of supremacy, I think, is probably the mark that's maybe easiest for people to see.
Yeah, I went ahead and took the liberty of looking up, like, or trying to get a list of, like, current state laws that are in, some kind of state of litigation. And there's quite a few. We can put that out in show notes, or we don't have to do that, but we can do something where, like, we can show some of these things, and maybe I'll write a Substack about it. But there is quite a few laws, right, that are happening challenging this. And of course, I'm thinking about how, like, people I know, and even my own, like, way that I used to view, I've shifted for sure, but I still have a lot of empathy for conservative views. I consider myself a conservative. And I guess one thing is, like, thinking about, like, at what point does, like, accommodation become endorsement? Like, essentially, like, you have different places, like Louisiana. I highly doubt that there's going to be, like, a 10, commandment, rule in New York City, for instance. I doubt that that's going to pass, or Los Angeles, or California, or, the Northwest, Northeast, right? Take these geographical locations. It'll be challenged in Virginia. I'm sure that I haven't looked, but there may be something already being proposed, at least. I know in Ohio, there's been a law that's passed that's allowing, more leeway in terms of religious education, specifically Christian in this case. So I definitely see that. But it's like, is this just like, hey, this is our culture. This is who we are. This is this is what people want. And we want states to be able to have the freedom to do that. I'm not going to New York and making them do, do things. And I felt like New York was coming to Ohio and making Ohio change, with all sorts of inclusion because of federal, and it didn't represent me or my community. I'm trying to take on the form of people I've talked to, I'm sure you've talked to, and the way that they're thinking. Because if I don't enter into the way they're thinking, then I don't really have empathy, and I can get mad at them about hating empathy, but I'm not really doing it myself.
Yeah, I think it's really important not to dismiss the concerns of people who are seriously engaged.
When does accommodation become endorsement, and how do we test those lines, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, there are substantial there were substantial accommodations in place. So there's religious release time, which has been legal for a very long time, which is essentially in the public school. You can go for religious instruction during public educational hours just outside of the public education building. It's kind of a kludge. Like, it's still public education being like, okay, you can do religious stuff, but it's not in the building itself. Kids could always pray in schools. Teachers could always pray in schools. Teachers couldn't make kids pray in schools. Kids could organize groups that were prayer groups that had like faculty sponsors in those spaces. So
see
the
you at
simple,
the pole, right? I remember going to see you at the pole when I was in high school.
I went to Catholic school, so we,
everything was religious.
Yeah. But the idea is like the simplistic understanding that somehow God or religion was pushed out of school, like, does not do justice to the faith that people have. And so I think, as you say, the tension is, what should our schools do? Our understanding is our schools should not establish Christian supremacy with public money. And one of the issues that emerges from there is like, okay, well, so then if public money is going to religious schools, which it is, that might be a little stickier, because we don't want to impose on religious beliefs in religious spaces, but we might have concerns about what public money is doing in those religious spaces. And I think that's a debate point that we might have. Your larger question also is an important one of like, what do we do with like regional difference? And one of the things that educational scholars often talk about is like, big educational reform always falls apart in the United States because the public education is so diffuse. It always kind of runs against the shoals of the fact that we have so many schools in so many different contexts in so many different places doing so many different things. So what should we allow in one space and not in another? I think what we had in the past was this idea that you could teach about religion, but you couldn't proselytize. And we may have lost that line. I don't know where that gets us. I have serious concerns about it.
Have you, can I just mention this real quick?
Go ahead.
Have you seen this new Texas, essentially, what was it? Was it the law or an executive order? Well, I'm trying to remember, but essentially that judges, it was trying to say that judges could not sign like marriage certificates.
Yeah, for same
because of religious conviction. But no, I see similarities because of, public institutions, things that are supposed to be kind of general, right? If you're a teacher, you're supposed to serve the general public, right? Anyone comes in, right? It doesn't matter if they're Muslim, black, white, in any on any of the spectrum of the LGBTQ and anywhere there, right? It doesn't. You're supposed to treat them, give them the same education you would, right? Anyone. That's kind of the American ideal, it would seem to me at this point. At least that's how I grew up, and yet that's being challenged. Anyway, sorry. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to underplay the way in which, particularly for like LGBTQ rights, this is devastating. So, there was a teacher in Georgia who was fired last year for reading, what was the book? My Shadow is Purple, which talked about like gender identity and difference. And because of divisive concept laws in the state of Georgia, this teacher was fired by the school district. You and I, we talked before this. My colleague is not here because she's concerned about the implications that this brief will have on her job as a university professor in a different state. That strikes me as, obviously as censorship, self-censorship, people who are concerned about their jobs. But the idea with the first example is like this is a sense that these kinds of people shouldn't exist because of my religious convictions. There are lots of different versions of God and faith and religion out there. I want to assert that in the public sphere, using religion to say that a certain kind of person shouldn't exist might be a line we don't want to cross at the level of education, particularly with children.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'd expect people are going to say and or react to is the fact that, You're using Christian nationalism to kind of define sort of like the group and the politics somewhat. Christianity is the largest religion in America. A lot of people identify very closely to that identity, like I am a Christian. And like if your title, instead of it saying Christian nationalism and educational policy in the United States, if it said, I don't know, Black theology, I'm just throwing something out there, and educational policy, like you would probably get quite a bit of, sternly worded emails about that. And you're like, hey, you're talking about Black and then theology, So like here, like you're talking about Christian and nationalism, and with Christians being such a large group in the country, like how do you expect to kind of like wrestle, discuss, convince Christians that you're not like personally attacking them and or attacking their faith?
Yeah. Well, I think people should read James Cone and M. Sean Copeland anyways. Like Black theology is great. I think that it's a great question, because I do think that there is a sense for conservative Christians particularly that the liberal establishment, but also that public education has been attacking religion for any number of years. That's not entirely untrue in certain ways. Fair enough. The concern that I have, I was thinking earlier today about this idea from John Dominic Crossan, the notion that like the kingdom of humanity is concerned with peace through victory, and the kingdom of God is concerned with peace through justice. And my sense is, from the kind of Catholicism that I grew up with, there's this idea of faith-seeking understanding. I don't know that there's a whole lot of understanding that goes on in an ideology, Christian nationalism, that is focused primarily on domination. So that's one answer, and probably an unsatisfying one for people who really believe deeply in this. So there's a guy named Paul Miller who is an evangelical and who had worked in the Bush administration.
We've had him on the show.
You've had him on the show, yeah. So his, the religion of American greatness, like he's trying to make a distinction between like the political project and the faith project. I don't know that I can make that distinction, but he's trying to salvage this project that he's worked his life towards. Peter Wehner writes all this stuff all the time. And I think that the real struggle there, David French is another one who's in the middle of this right now, is this community that I was a part of. It's not the community I thought I was a part of. One of the things that I would say to Christians who are concerned about this is like, if you are coming to conclusions that run counter to the way in which you view the kind of manifestation of Jesus you have in your life, then that might concern us about the political movement with which you might be tethered. And for the people who are ambassadors, who are Christian nationalists, I don't know that I have an answer other than like there's this podcast called Faithful Politics that tries to engage in these kinds of conversations.
Well, I appreciate the endorsement. So this is the last question. What is your call for people? What do you want them to hear? And I guess maybe address two people. What do you want the MAGA listener? Welcome, MAGA listener, by the way. We love you. And I pray for Donald Trump. He's my president. I pray for him. I pray for the people that are in office. I truly do. And when I think about him, I have ADHD, so I don't do it all the time. So don't hold me to that, but I definitely do when I think about it. But what's your call to the MAGA person who's listening and they're like, dude, we finally have someone taking action. We've been oppressed for years by this kind of Marxist, that kind of idea. Mm-hmm. And again, you don't have to address that argument. Just
sure.
What's the call to them, and what's the call to the person who's like, I can't believe my neighbor voted for Donald Trump. I want nothing to do with them. I haven't talked to my cousin in 3 years because of that fight at Thanksgiving. What's the call?
Yeah, it's hard. I'll say, debate isn't We know that's not effective. We know that presenting people with facts is not effective. But that's, to a certain degree, that's the benefit of faith, is it's rooted in mystery. Ultimately, we don't know. So to someone who is embedded in the MAGA movement, what I would say is that I am not your enemy. The people who are engaged in the educational project are there by and large because they love kids. This is a language I play around with, generally speaking. Their particular manifestation of love might not look like what your love looks like, but it is certainly not rooted in hate, particularly if you were a Christian in that space. Fundamental principle of teaching: do less harm next time. That's from a former professor of mine. And then for my friends, many of whom I have, who are really concerned with the idea of like a neighbor who might feel irredeemable, I had a professor named Mike Himes. He was a priest in the Brooklyn diocese, but he taught at Boston College where I went. So he had a Brooklyn British accent because his aunts were British. So like imagine that accent as he's talking. But he talked about the sacraments in the Catholic Church. There's 7 of them. So like reconciliation and baptism and last rites. And he said that the sacraments are our experience of God's grace extended beyond the Trinity. The particular 7 sacraments that are in the church themselves are just the ways in which we attend to that grace. That grace is everywhere. We just need to attend to it. So the sacramental principle is that we can attend to the grace in other people all the time if we choose to, even if it's hard. That might be your call, regardless of whether you have religion or not. What is it? I was just talking the other day, this idea of haexiety, the irreducible thisness of a thing. For Christians, that'd be the soul. But like, what is the haexiety of the person before you that most matters, stripped away of all of the political trappings? It's hard, but there's grace there.
I really, really, really love that. How can people get involved? Where would you send them to learn more? And then where can people find the policy to look at it?
Yeah, the policy brief is at the National Educational Policy Center. I believe that's nepc.org, if I had to guess. I'm at the University of Georgia. I teach about religion and education. If anybody wants to come and do a PhD, we'd love to have you. If anybody wants to come and be an English teacher in the state of Georgia, we'd love to have you as well, because that's the organization in which I teach. And, you know, I've written a lot of books and a lot of articles that essentially, because they're academic, nobody reads. So pick those up and let me know that they're unreadable. I'd love to hear from you.
When you say academic, are you talking about like, are they like $100 or something like that? Like that's why nobody's reading.
They can't. No, I mean, like who would find an academic
so
journal?
Expensive sometimes.
Yeah.
It's
email
so
me.
crazy.
I'll send it to you. But also, like, my first book, I spent a year as a fake high school senior at an all boys Catholic school.
What?
Like, I think that was kind of fun. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Crazy. You said amazing. I said crazy at the same time. That's so funny.
Thanks.
Well, man, thank you so much for being on the show, Kevin. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation. And, man, I just got to say, I really appreciate the way you articulated your position, truly. I think people should listen and at least contend with the ideas. We need to get back to contending with ideas and not people like we have been. So thanks again for doing that.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. And to our viewers, guys, thanks for joining. And our listeners, thanks for listening to another episode of the Faithful Politics Podcast. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all that stuff that helps us get this great content out there. We need sanity at a time when there's so much partisan hostility right now. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless. Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.